Can mobility training help overcome a fear of getting hurt again? Here's my answer. So I think that we can all relate to this. At some level, we all do some activity, mess up something doesn't go planned, and we get injured. We roll our ankle while running. We dislocate a shoulder playing some other sport. Personally, I've been lucky not to be severely injured, but that doesn't mean that I've never been injured before. A little over a year ago, I was playing basketball, and I was just playing a random pickup game at the community center, and it was, 3-on-3. My teammate shoots, misses, I try to get the rebound, I jump up, and as I land, I roll over on that person's foot. I land on their foot, and then I roll my ankle. And I was playing with a bunch of high school kids. I was the only adult, so it figures the old man goes down. So are you curious what I did? Because I definitely know what I should do, but I'll be honest with you. In that instance, I did nothing. Basically, I spent the whole time either following the RICE protocol, rest, ice, compress, elevate, for a few days, and sometimes I change it up and I did the NICER protocol, one that I learned from a college professor. NICER was like non-inflammatory drugs, ice, compression, elevation, rest. And I just did that for about 3-4 days. After about 3-4 days, I was definitely ready to return back to real life, but I wasn't really ready to return back to sport. Because if I were to return back to playing basketball, my ankle wouldn't be able to handle the stopping, the starting, the jumping, the landing, the twisting. So I ended up returning back to basketball after 3 weeks. My ankle was not feeling 100%, but I felt like I was good enough. And I just told myself I wouldn't play a pickup game, I would only, practice some shots. And at the time, that's when the Toronto Raptors were, by the way, I'm a Raptors fan. This is when the Toronto Raptors were in the middle of their 2018-2019 NBA season. So I just had to go and practice some Kawhi Leonard style shots. By the way, this was far before the shot actually happened. Anyway, so I show up, I take a couple shots, some people invite me to play, and then I end up playing. How do I justify it to myself? I end up telling myself, you know what, your ankle probably won't be able to handle it, but it's okay. Just don't jump for rebounds and don't play defense too hard, and then you should be fine. You're just taking some pretty easy shots. You're just kind of jogging back and forth a couple times. Now keep in mind, that's just what I said to justify the bad decision. It was not a good decision. It's not something that I would recommend to other people, but honestly, that's what I did. So you can probably guess what happened. I sprained my ankle again. Stupid me, I jumped up for a rebound again. I landed down on someone's foot again and rolled the same ankle again in the same way again. Now, there's a really unique type of regret that someone feels, that when they knew better, but they chose to ignore their better judgment. Alright, so I will get back onto topic. So, could mobility exercises have helped me return back to that sport quicker? Well, yes. And the way we define mobility exercises in the functional range systems, generally speaking, is how much usable range of motion do you have, or how much ability do you have to express movement at a joint. And I've already talked about this before, but I'll reiterate this. When we talk about, so I've mentioned this in a previous video, but I'll say it again. Injuries occur, there's a very basic formula. When the capacity going into a tissue exceeds, so how did the injury occur? There's a very simple formula that describes it. When the load that goes into a tissue exceeds the load-bearing capacity, that tissue is most likely going to get injured. It's going to yield. When the load is less than the capacitor, when the load going into a tissue is less than the capacity for that tissue to handle, then you have rehabilitation. It's easier. And when your capacity in a joint is greater than the load being placed into it, then you have injury prevention. Of course, you can't really 100% prevent injury. What we can just do is put ourselves in a position to mitigate damage so that when things do happen, we aren't affected as severely. So if we look at me spraining my ankle as an event in time, the load that went into that tissue, my ankle, exceeded the load-bearing capacity, so there was an injury. So sure, there were certain exercises I could have done to try and regain back some of the lost strength and lost active range of motion that I had. For example, I could have maybe done some Pales Rails work in, ankle inversion, eversion, working into dorsiflexion. However, I want us to think about for a second, think about our joint health as kind of a bank account. So let's say right now, when you're born, let's say your ankle joint has an account of like $1,000, which is a lot, because with a child you can bend an ankle quite a bit and it's probably not going to break because they're just so malleable, they're just so movable. Anyways, fast forward when you're a teenager, when you get into your 20s, in order to maintain healthy joints, you have to continue to put consistent input. You have to do one workout that puts like $1 in the joint health jar. You continue putting deposits in, so that one day when you're running around playing with some friends and you roll your ankle on a curve, or you like jump over something and you pull something, when an injury occurs, it withdraws money from that jar, and if you don't have enough of a buffer, then you go into the red, then you sustain an injury. If you already have a good foundation, though, being hurt won't impact you as greatly. It's still, of course, not fun. However, if we're talking about returning back to the activity or returning back to the sport that you do, it's really valuable sometimes for us to be able to mitigate the damage that is done, because that can be the difference between returning to your sport or activity in 2 weeks versus returning in 6 weeks. So in case that example didn't make sense, I'll explain it a bit more technically. So if we look at my ankle, I definitely could have benefited from doing something like Pales Rails for my ankle, which is a isometric exercise, progressively angular isometric loading or regressive angular isometric loading protocol. It's an exercise where it uses isometric contractions to teach our nervous system on how to move in newly acquired ranges of motion. And it also affects changes in our body at a cellular level. It's not only making improvements on like the muscular level, it's also making improvements on the cellular level, like the extracellular matrix, and on the microtubules. There you go. I almost forgot that term. No, so it affects not only the muscle, but it affects things on a cellular level that influence the change on how the cell of the muscle and how the cell of everything is going to be shaped. So ultimately, if you have confidence in the prescription that somebody gives you and you have trust in the person who you're working with, then the equation's actually really simple. You should receive comfort in knowing that if your joint can handle this much force, then you're only giving it this much force. And because there's a buffer between the two, that gives your joint, that gives your body time and opportunity to improve. Anyways, that's going to do it for everything today. If you did appreciate this, I would love that you would give it a comment. If you want to hear more information, if you want to see more stuff about me, I always upload stuff about fitness, mobility. Please hit that subscribe button. Without further ado, I will talk to you in the next video. Bye.